who have been in the sexual assault world as long as me. There's debate on if it's quote unquote legitimate. Oops, sorry, I let somebody into the room and I turned the screen. And we're also going to talk about, is it PTSD and what that means. So who am I? I'm the clinical director at the Mental Health Collective. I'm also an adjunct professor at the University of Southern California. I spent a decade there as an associate professor and have recently stepped down to work at the Mental Health Collective and continue to stay in touch with the students, and particularly the founding director of the Keck Human Rights Clinic. Related to this topic, I think it's important for you to know that I am an advisory board member for Meta on the global safety team, particularly around non-consensual sharing of intimate images. We go to the Facebook or now Meta offices every year. It's a global audience, and we have real conversations about how difficult it is for large organizations like Meta to get a handle on this and protect victims and advocate for survivors. And I am finishing my 20th year as a social worker in Los Angeles. The entirety of my time has been spent in sexual violence. And I have a number of published studies and books on this topic. In fact, I'm going to share some of my research from unpublished research right now on 50 interviews I did with revenge porn survivors and how their mental health is shaping. I also want to talk briefly about terminology. You will hear me use the term victim and survivor differently, and I think it's important that we understand that difference. So the term victim is a forensic word. It's used in courtrooms and when we're talking about a crime. So you are victimized in a crime, and that is how it's written in forensic writing. Survivor is once you leave the legal system, you are seen as a survivor. So when I talk about therapy and things like that, I will be using the term survivors. I use forensic terms for the person who shares these images, like perpetrator, the accused, the assailant. And part of this language is also very heteronormative. So I just want to call that out. We'll get into a little bit of the diversity considerations of this issue, but for the most part, this is seen and researched in a heteronormative way, men enacting violence on women. So I do want to acknowledge that as we go into this conversation. The last thing is just to acknowledge that there is real stories that are going to be included in this talk and direct discussions about symptoms following rape and sexual assault. So I just want to acknowledge that there's a bit of a trigger warning here, and obviously take care of yourself in whatever way you need to, including signing off. This will be recorded. So when I sit down at the Thanksgiving dinner table and my family asks me what I've been up to lately, it's always like, how real is this? Does this really happen, or is this just a niche thing? So I just have statistics here from 2017 because there was quite a spread of this in the news. And then 2019, we actually saw an elected political figure in California resign from office because of her partner sharing illicit images without her consent. But in 2017, we had 3 big moments where I think the term revenge porn started entering the conversation. So the first was a private Facebook group called Marines United, where images that mostly female service members did not know was being taken of them, or if it was shared consensually to their partner, was non-consensually shared into this Facebook page where they sexually humiliated and taunted the women in this group. And eventually someone exposed it and it made the news. There were congressional hearings with promises to change. And then a year later, another scandal happened on WhatsApp. So this is an epidemic of sexual violence that the military has recognized and is trying to understand. We've seen this in medical facilities. The incident in 2017 involved a nurse who took a picture of her sleeping patient's penis and shared it with a lot of friends. And then many of you might remember Rob Kardashian sharing naked pictures of his then ex-partner, Blac Chyna, to social media, and that really making national headlines as well. So what is technology-facilitated sexual violence? Well, it's a lot of things. And the most famous term is revenge porn. I don't like using revenge porn, though I know it's sexy for the media and people like to use that most commonly. Revenge porn is problematic because it implies that someone's doing it out of revenge. So a lot of people in the public opinion court of law, if you will sort of weigh it on, did that person deserve to have these photos exposed because the first person was hurt and so they were getting back at them, that revenge conversation. These things are often not enacted in those sorts of ways. There absolutely are, and I'm going to show you some studies where partners are going to share photos out of revenge, but often it's a form of bonding. There are adolescent groups where one person will receive a picture of someone they like, a picture they've asked for, and then they will pass it around by text or other things, not out of revenge, but just out of bragging. We have celebrities who have been hacked and their naked images have been shown around the internet without permission. The Marines United example is a great example of people who are taking pictures without consent and without the knowledge of the person and sharing that widely. We have something called deep fakes where, they're like little dancing people. You saw it a lot during the presidential election of Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump, right? Where they're like dancing around. You can do it for Christmas cards, but 90% of deep fakes are pornographic in nature and used to often be sold and sometimes humiliate the person in which they're involved. There are many cases now. For instance, there was a case, I believe, in Kansas of a third grade teacher whose ex-partner put her face on a pornographic deepfake and she lost her job and had to move out of her neighborhood because of the effects of that, even though that wasn't her. It was completely fake. It looks so real. It's hard to convince the school board and things otherwise. So there's that. And then there's actual sexual violence that is recorded and posted. And when we're talking about this, we're talking about it not just through text messages or social media, but also the dark web. There's a lot of pornographic sites that you have to share a new photo in order to get access to the cache of photos that's on that site. So it's a very deep issue. Lots of different terms here. It depends on what country you're in and what soapbox you're on as to what you're going to use. As you can tell, I like technology-facilitated sexual violence, but there's other things like digital sexual violence, the non-consensual sharing of intimate images, image-based sex abuse. And I'm going to show you some research from Asia Eaton in Florida that refers to that last one, non-consensual pornography. All of these things encompass sexual violence enacted online. Before I get into laws, I just want to take a pause. Does anyone have any questions or clarifications around anything I just said? And feel free to just talk if you do. Okay.
I have a quick question about deepfakes. So deepfakes is not just, it's a real face on a different image, not necessarily just a moving figure, right?
Right. So the most common way I've seen it in my private practice world is it's a video and someone has had access to thousands of that victim's faces, so they could upload it. So the video then gets every angle of the face. And it's on like a pornographic movie where they superimpose that person's face on top of someone else's, but it can be other creations of that.
Cool, thanks.
Yeah. And this, when I started talking about this in 2016, it was pretty hard. Like you needed to be pretty digitally sophisticated to do a deep fake. Now there's free apps. So it's just really easy to do this now. Any other questions?
Quick one for you, Dr. Z.
Yeah.
Where does sexual violence or depiction of sexual violence in video games come into play? Is that part of this conversation or is that something different?
It's an important conversation. Gamergate is something I often talk about in bigger lectures. So it's a form of technology-facilitated sexual violence, absolutely. It's not a form of the focus of today's session, which is non-consensual image sharing. So now we're getting into the weeds of terms.
Thank you.
Yeah, good question though. Okay, so I'm not an attorney, but I have a lot of thoughts about revenge porn and laws. So first of all, the laws in our states, which are 48 states and the District of Columbia, is usually about revenge porn. You will see by this map what's a misdemeanor, what's a felony, and where no law exists. I do believe Wyoming just instituted a law before or after this map was created. The issue, like in California, so I put the definition of what constitutes a misdemeanor in California. So the intentional distribution of images, right? Can you prove that? Maybe. While understanding that those were intended, number 3, to cause harm, either psychological, emotional harm. So I want you to think about this as a definition. When we talk about, other forms of sexual assault, do we have to prove like intent? Like, well, they raped her because they intended to cause emotional harm, right? So there's already victim blame and bias in this law and many laws across the country. It's not just, was a naked image of your body shared without your consent? It was, did they have intent to hurt you? So there's a lot of criticism from that. The other thing with state laws across the board is there's not really, New York probably has the best one right now, but the issue is it's hard to define consent. So in some states, if you took the picture of your body and you consensually passed it on to this person you like, and they took that picture, it then becomes their property. So they can do with it what they want. And so they can share it widely. So the only way in those states that you could be prosecuted is if you actually took it from the person and could prove that the person did not give it to you consensually. In other cases, you might be asleep and there might be naked pictures taken of you, or you might be really intoxicated and video might be taken of you that you didn't consent to. Some states still don't consider that a crime because the person's images was on their phone or their camera and it's their property and they took it. And so therefore there's nothing illegal happening by them sharing their property. So lots of controversy in these laws. California is a misdemeanor, and so that doesn't really offer too much prevention. In 2020, I was set to speak in Sacramento on this law, trying to make it actually a felony for sharing intimate images without someone's consent. But obviously, I think the court case was like March 18th, 2020. Things shut down and it's never been brought back up. So we're still waiting on that. Any questions here?
Quick question for you.
Yeah.
In terms of their intent, what would be, in the eyes of the law, what would be any other intent besides being mean or hurting somebody? What else is there? Great
question. Hold on to that. I'm going to show you a research study I can point to. You're walking me into the next phase. Okay, so technology-facilitated sexual violence. So the 3 areas I want to cover, right? Is it domestic violence, interpersonal violence? Do we consider it sexual assault and rape? And can it cause PTSD? What do we know? So for the first question, when you look and compare at the victims of interpersonal violence to the victims of intimate images being illicitly shared, you're seeing the same demographics. So again, that heteronormative demographic, it's male perpetrators aggressing female victims, a higher incidence of women of color, a much higher incidence in the LGBTQI community, both, by the way, as perpetrators as well as victims. And just like in sexual assault and interpersonal violence, you much more commonly know the person that shared this image than it being a complete stranger. So statistics, it looks like the same issue. The military is struggling with this because when you're a victim of interpersonal violence or sexual violence in the military, regardless of if you discharge with what's the term, honorable discharge or not, you're eligible to free psychotherapy sessions. But the military has not categorized this as sexual violence or domestic violence. So people who are victimized in this aren't eligible for those free counseling sessions like other sexual violence survivors would be. So getting to your question, Lindsay, how about intent? There was a big study done in 2017 by Asia Eaton and her colleagues. I have the publication down there below for any of you academics who want to look it up. What they did is they looked at 5 years worth of newspaper articles, and a separate and related study is they interviewed people as well who reported to either have been victimized or aggressed. And what they found was the number one way people shared this information was by text message. The second common way was either in person, showing their friends or a group of friends through chats online, and then social media being the next place. But then they asked, why did you do it? Why did you share it? And so the first one, and this tends to be what we get in adolescent populations, high school, middle school, and going into college is, well, I didn't want to hurt the person. I just wanted to brag. You know, I got this hot photo and, you know, I wanted to show off, or it was a cheerleader and nobody believed that she was into me. And so I showed this as proof. And so getting back to that legal question, Lindsay, the law wants to give those people who they didn't know would hurt the person a break, right? And so they're trying to protect what I would say the perpetrators of this crime. We'll talk about adolescents in just a minute, like 1 or 2 more slides, because there's a lot to say there. But what were other reasons that they shared? You can see there's a very low percentage there of like to ruin their life or to be popular on the internet. It's more about self-bragging and self-esteem, right, within their circle. So there's some really interesting studies and researchers looking not at revenge porn, but at sexting in middle school and high school. What's the purpose? What's the incidence, and how, you know, is it something we can understand? And so Jenny Lloyd published research last year, particularly on sexting in schools. And her hypothesis was that it's actually a new form of the Polaroid, right? It's maybe not even in my generation, but certainly the generation above me, you know, it was cool to take like a sexy Polaroid and put it in your boyfriend's book, for example, right? So it's not that images haven't been shared. I think about the Titanic and that like topless painting or drawing that he did, right? So it's not that sexual imagery hasn't been around, but it hasn't been around in this rapid of a delivery system. So her argument is, though we try, and it is sexualization of children. We had a scandal in my local hometown where someone sexted a partner, that partner shared it in a group chat, immediately that's child pornography, right? So police are involved, the child is suspended, and huge things that, you know, DCFS can be involved. It's a huge thing that can happen. And is it a sexualization of children? Absolutely. But is it also, to Lloyd's argument, about sexual agency and sexual exploration, and have generations and generations done this during a totally developmental appropriate time? But what's lacking is our understanding as a society of what consent is, what digital consent is, and how we teach that to our children, right? We give our children messages, hopefully, that you don't show your genitals to other people in person, right? But are we teaching our kids digital consent and what that looks like? And that can even be extended into dating apps. I think it's a 60% statistic on, I think it was Hinge. I should have written this down. No, it was Tinder. 60% of people on Tinder have shared naked images of themselves with someone they were talking to on Tinder. Now, I'm not going to poll all of you, but I'm sure all of you know somebody who's in the dating world and has received a dick pic or sent a dick pic or asked for a boob shot or whatever, right? So this is the way that people are talking and playing through totally consensual sexual means. One way that some advocates say that you can get a hold on the illicit sharing piece is if you can like trademark or water stamp your images and actually say like not for sharing. Could you imagine doing that? You know, watermarking your images, but they're trying to create ways for this to happen in a consensual manner and legally so that it can prevent. But I think it's also just about having conversations, you know, with our partners. And it's also about dating apps and things taking responsibility for that on their platforms. There was actually a really scary case on Grindr where someone was trying to take revenge and actually hurt somebody. So he put out a profile of this person he wanted to hurt, started having conversations with men on Grindr and would say like, here's my address. I'm gonna act like I don't know you. I'm gonna act like I don't want it, but force it on me. And so people would go over and to this unsuspecting man's house and be sexually aggressive, and in some cases hurt him quite severely because that's what the Grindr profile told them to do. And this actually made it to the Supreme Court. She actually wanted to get this heard at a Supreme Court level. It ended up not getting heard 2 years ago, but she's trying to, this is Carrie Goldberg in New York. She's sort of like the revenge porn attorney. She's trying to make technology companies take responsibility for this on their platforms, right? And Grindr refused to. Grindr was like, this is a profile, it's the person who's posting's fault, not my fault. And it took a lot of work for them to actually take that profile down. You know, organizations like Meta or Facebook take it as a real responsibility. They have ways that you can report this. They have a whole crew that can help you take it down. But even in that instance, Facebook got a lot of slack in Australia because they were trying to find a way to prevent revenge porn from happening on the platform. And so the way that they tried to handle it is asked victims to send their naked images to Facebook so Facebook could scan them and then find them and remove them. So the intent was good, but what the hell are they thinking? Who's going to send your naked photos, right, to this organization? And the problem is they really value the encrypted apps, you know, Facebook Messenger, WhatsApp, they're all encrypted. And, you know, these communication apps have been instrumental in like calling out political violence and, you know, creating grassroots resistance across the globe. And so the encryption piece is really key in their mind for allowing conversations to happen in a truly private way. But the problem is when something illegal is happening, unless someone within the group invites somebody from the organization to go into that group, they'll never violate that encryption. And so that's how that gets perpetuated on the platforms. Taking another break, any questions or clarifications?
I'm curious with like younger kids, because obviously there's been a lot of controversy over like taking a photo of your kid in the bathtub or whatever it is. Like
we had a case in Facebook where the mom was pissed at the son for having a house party while she was gone. And he was like half naked and hungover, and she took a picture of him and like spread it all over social media to humiliate him. And Facebook asked us in the task force, like, is this sexual violence? And it's, you know, it's interesting conversation. Sorry, Lauren.
No, yeah, I'm curious, like, you know, at what point is it like, okay, they take a picture of their 4-year-old in the bath, they send it to family. Does it then become harmful when they send it to a friend? Like where's the line, I guess, or how do the laws apply to that?
Yeah, I don't know that any laws would apply to that right now. I do think that as a parent, I have had to think about that too, right? When does your kids consent? I mean, how many times have you all seen on social media, like someone's cute toddler naked butt or something, right? And at what point does your kid have a part in saying that's not okay? I don't consent to that. I think traditional laws would say 18 years old is when you get that legal consent piece, but that's, we all know that's probably too late, right? So I don't know if that answers your question, Lauren. There's no black and white law that I know of in that way, but it is a cultural conversation piece we need to start having. Any other questions? Okay. So now I'm going to get into more specific stuff regarding rape and PTSD specifically. So again, just acknowledging that trigger warning. So I have done a study with 50 survivors of revenge porn. So people who have identified themselves as a victim of revenge porn and have chosen to talk to me about it. In addition to the survivors, we had another, I think it was 35, do the anonymous survey, but did not sit down and interview with us. And so you're looking at the results of about 75 survivors of revenge porn and how they described this reaction and where their images were found. So in our study, over 50% were shared on social media. Varying social media platforms, often being tagged, having their parents, their grandparents tagged, their place of work tagged, things like that, group messaging, chat apps. Again, the dark web and emails is there, but in a much smaller way. So I told you this already. You don't care about what software I use to analyze. Okay. So who were the perpetrators in the sample? 75% were intimate partners and 16% surprisingly were strangers. This is like almost identical to what we know of sexual assault or rape, okay? That world tends to fall between 75 and 82% as being acquaintances. So again, when we're asking, is this rape, is this sexual violence? Well, it seems to be pretty similar demographically as we look at it. So who saw the images? Close friends, over 50%, coworkers, 1 in 3, family members, 1 in 3. So this is not just your naked body is online and strangers are seeing it, but people who you work with and that you interact with every day have actually seen this. And when you do these interviews, it's really sad because often the question is, well, my work was tagged, or well, my boss didn't make eye contact with me for the next 2 weeks, so I think they saw it. But there's actually no way of knowing for sure. And for those of us who treat PTSD and sexual violence, we know the effect that has on someone's mental health and someone's ability to go out socially and just feel safe. And feeling safe is the key to recovering from a stress response like PTSD. And if now your family's seen it and your workplace has seen it, where do you go and who do you talk to feel safe, right? This is also something that comes up with people of face-to-face sexual violence and rape who have been drugged and don't have any memory. The idea of, I don't know who did this, is a big question mark for them, and it makes their symptoms, especially their avoidance symptoms, worse, right? Because when you don't have any memory of being sexually assaulted, the person behind you, I've had so many survivors say, the person behind me in the grocery store line could be my perpetrator. There's just no way to know. And that's the same thing in this case. Even if only one person shared your image, who saw that image, what was said about that image, all of a sudden the world becomes potentially someone who's humiliated you in their mind. And it just really affects somebody deeply in their mental health and their recovery. So we asked what was in the image. And the reason we asked this was to correlate severity of PTSD symptoms with the severity of the image. And it wasn't as clean as we hoped, but it certainly did show that the more body parts that were exposed in the image itself, the higher symptomology of PTSD that we found in the sample. The follow-up study we want to do is, are dick pics causing PTSD? If someone illicitly shares dick pics to their friends or on social media, is that the same thing if you're never tagged, right? Because there's like an anonymous element to it. So I don't know that answer, but we're interested. So comparing my study results to what we know about PTSD. So there is no study linking revenge porn or technology-facilitated sexual violence to PTSD. I want to start there. Many people wonder if you've never been touched, how you could have PTSD. That's often the question I get. And the result to that also is there's been, when we talk about EBPs, evidence-based practice, we're talking about a cohort of people that have been selected and studied for a certain therapy, and if this will reduce their PTSD symptoms. So we have no known therapy that has been studied with survivors of revenge porn. And so this is important because I'm going to argue in the time that we have left that the type of trauma symptoms the survivor has is uniquely different than what we see in traditional profiles of PTSD. So just to start off with, there's 5 criteria for PTSD. The first one is already questionable depending on who you talk to. So they want you to have direct exposure, witnessing, learned about it, or indirect exposure, like a therapist hearing a story or a firefighter watching a house burn down. So some experts have questioned with me that revenge porn survivors don't meet criteria 1 for PTSD, that your naked image is not direct exposure, is not witnessing, it's not all these things. I think most of us would argue with that, but that does exist. So the question is, can we find these other 3 items that are unique in digital violence? So talking about that first criteria, here's 2 stories. Now I want you, being a sexual assault therapist for 20 years, you might have a single incident trauma. So someone who was sexually assaulted, the sexual assault ended, it's one person. You can have multiple perpetrator sexual assaults, the assault ends and they know the multiple people, or there could be a number of incidents called chronic trauma over the lifespan. In this instance, like in the second example, 600 chat room logs about this person's body, uploaded the pictures over 300 times. Think about that in terms of your stress response and how that affects you. And the first one, the Flickr account where it was uploaded had her last name attached to it, and people tried to contact her regarding that. Okay, so going back to the diagnosis of PTSD, let's look and see if we can find avoidance, re-experiencing, alterations in cognitions and mood and arousal. So we saw digital avoidance. So avoidance in typical sexual assault reactions is they avoid the place where they were sexually assaulted. They avoid reminders. In combat PTSD, a lot of the wars took place on sand. So when they get back to California, going to a beach is something they'll avoid because of the reminder of that. Well, we were curious about that in our sample, and we found lots of examples of how people become avoidant digitally. Some people who just shut off social media completely. We talked to lots of parents who forbid their kids on social media. And we saw opposite as well, where it increased, but definitely a commonality of I'm no longer going to participate, even taking photos of myself. Many of our participants no longer even are just in photos with family because of the fear of that, of what that could do. So alterations in cognitions and mood, we're watching how their technology use changes. Some become like digital pirates, where they're out to get everybody and they lock up their stuff and they're like a super informed information specialist on how you can protect yourself, and will consult with other survivors around that. Where others might change their technology use. Like I can think of one interview where she was so violated and so humiliated. The way that she tried to re-engage was she started taking more naked photos and putting it out there and making money from it. Because in her mind, it's like, my body's already been violated, so now I'm going to try to take control and at least benefit from this. In traditional sexual violence recovery, you see this with survivors as well, not through technology, but some survivors do choose to become more sexually promiscuous after a sexual assault rather than avoiding sexual contact. So we're seeing those same parallels, but with a technology-specific lean. Long-term effects. So this is something that I want to draw attention to, because unlike most, unless you're in a situation where you're married to someone who's constantly perpetrating against you, most sexual violence episodes have a start and end date in time. Technology-facilitated sexual violence, often those images never come down. The amount of stories that we had with survivors who would try to get Flickr, for example, to take down the image, and the perpetrator would then just create a new account and repost it. There's a lot of porn sites that specialize in casual pictures, and they often find their way there. A lot of those porn sites are receptive to taking the images and videos down, but again, just reposting. So the long-term effects of what this means, knowing that people can see your naked body despite every effort for you to stop that. One survivor I spoke to, it happened in a relationship, and her son was now coming of age, and she had to sit down with her son and say, hey, if you ever go to these porn sites, you might see a video of me. And she had to explain the sexual violence to her son. Digital hypervigilance is in almost every case of every client and every research participant I've spoken to. It almost looks like OCD, like a unique form of OCD. These are survivors who wake up in the morning and before they get their coffee are on Facebook, eBay, YouTube, and whatever site they know that's been posted to, and just do a sweep to make sure their body's not there. And then they go about their day, and then at lunch, they do it again. And then at night, before they go to bed, they do it again. And I've talked to some people that have a ritual in the middle of the night, getting up and doing it again. It becomes an obsessive compulsion that they have to continue to do, or their body can't feel safe. They have to reassure themselves that the images are not there. There's also a sense of a lack of discomfort for those clients who didn't get off Facebook. Every new friend request brings anxiety and worry because they're afraid their body's been shared, and they're starting to get the stream of friend requests from all the perverts who want to talk to them from that account that was opened. So I just want to put this back up here one last time. You can see how a lot of these things match the criteria of PTSD. Not to mention, we gave the PCL5 to all of these survivors, and high incidence of current post-traumatic stress disorder at the time of interview. Now, it's always hard to know, were there previous traumas that were causing the PTSD or the revenge porn specifically? And so that's why we took a deeper dive into looking at these specific symptoms. I'm almost done, but I just want to pause for a minute and get any questions before I end. Okay.
Well, I kind of have a question. I mean,
Yeah.
it's a little loaded, but
I don't mind. I don't mind if you don't mind.
I guess I'm not sure exactly. Like, how do you even help someone that is living in that much fear just 24/7. Like when you mentioned the, you know, maybe they're standing at Vaughn's and they're in so much fear, they think the man behind them or, you know, the boy behind them, you know, it's like, how do you even walk through that's so much debilitating fear on a daily basis? Like, I just can't even fathom that.
You all are doing such a good job of leading me to my next thing. So I just so happen to have this slide here waiting to have this conversation. So
Okay.
thank you for that. I didn't pay Tess to ask that question, but it worked out beautifully. So that is, so in 20 years of treating sexual violence, I will tell you the survivors I've had in my practice are extremely hard to treat because this is a chart of how our body experiences stress. So when I teach it like at students, I always say, you know, we have a homeostasis that our nervous system lives in, right? It's up and down, but it's pretty steady. And then that X where it says perceived threat, that's like your final paper, right? You know it's coming, or your final exam, or I'm talking to therapists, your licensing exam. It's a perceived threat, right? And so your body sort of becomes more highly aroused. The fight or flight response can really be helpful in those situations and make you more focused on something, give you increased adrenaline, which gives you higher energy. You know, that can be beneficial for test taking and things like that. And then eventually the test is over and hopefully you go into this exhaustion place. And, you know, I'm talking about college students, you sleep for the next 3 days because your test is over and you're done studying, right? So that's how your nervous system's designed to be. When you don't get that exhaustion level for various reasons, you go into like survivors of domestic violence who are in the relationship and the threat is ongoing, we look at them into a chronic stress state, which is really what PTSD is. It's chronic levels of stress, right? So my goal as a therapist is to help their body return to homeostasis. So when I have somebody in a chronic stress state, I'm going to take a look at their nervous system and try to help get back to that homeostasis. So it might be their amygdala and their brainstem for like sleep-wake cycles, right? So we'll start getting them on like sleep hygiene. We'll maybe get them on medication for anxiety reduction. Maybe they could do a mindfulness protocol. And you begin after a couple of weeks for people with PTSD, if they really work hard to downregulate their nervous system, you're able to do that successfully in therapy. The problem I'm having with survivors of this violence is it's online still. You know, I have someone whose pictures show up on OnlyFans, like new accounts on OnlyFans. So not only does this perpetrator have the images, the perpetrator is making money off the images. And it is terrorizing for her to endure this. And Instagram profiles are being made with those images. And so her nervous system never recovers. And when I start trying to do the things I would do with people whose violence is over, it might work for a day and then a new OnlyFans account happens again. And it's, you know, re-arousal. And so that's really more so than ever, I feel deeply connected to law enforcement and legal policies on how we can help them feel safer, because that's the key. And I don't know, in the same way that we can't make memories of a rape go away, we can take the emotional connection to it away. That's the hope that I always tell my clients in therapy. I don't want to take the emotional connection to seeking justice of getting these fucking pictures taken down away, right? And so you become this advocate in trying to create safety in their social world. And you can do little things like who in your social world is safe, you know, how do you get heard, how do you know, those sorts of things. But in terms of nervous system arousal, it really feels much harder than other survivors. Did that answer your question, Tess?
Yes, it did. Thank you.
Any other questions on this or comments? Sometimes people need a minute to formulate their thoughts, so just give me in a minute. Okay. So So that's really what I wanted to emphasize, was just how not only do I want to legitimize this topic as a prominent feature in our current state, that it needs to be talked about more, certainly with therapists who treat trauma, but with policymakers and law enforcement to take these cases seriously. When I try to call these in and report these with my clients, it's rare that I get a law enforcement officer who's educated and even knows the state law. I often have to share the state law with them to let them know that they need to consider this a crime. So that's, we're so far behind in recognizing all of that within people who are supposed to protect us. So I'm just going to end with what we know right now. So we know through my study that PTSD is definitely there with unique facets of it, where there's lots of documentation of depression and anxiety that gets exacerbated following this. Somatic symptoms, for many of you know Bessel van der Kolk's book, The Body Keeps the Score. There's definitely the somatic re-trauma that happens that include anxiety in that as people work through this. So it is a very well-documented mental health crisis that's happening. A few just ending thoughts from a therapeutic lens. Our brain does not distinguish between kinds of trauma. It's just how much stress and how long did it endure. And this particular violence lasts a long time for most of the victims. So we're talking again about chronic stress in states of PTSD, and we need to start validating that in our therapeutic discourses. We need to link this, I think, in order to legitimize it with interpersonal violence and domestic violence. We need the military, for instance, to recognize it as a form of that. And we need to have a digital consent conversation with our colleagues and those of us who are parents with our kids, so that when someone says, my, sexy photo I sent my partner just got shared on Instagram, instead of the parent's reaction being, why the hell did you take a photo like that? The parent's reaction being, let's contact the authorities and get this taken down immediately. That was wrong. Right? Digital consent is an important conversation that we're not doing enough about, certainly with our kids and with each other in our current world. So I've answered a lot of these questions, but just a reminder of some things that I wanted to talk about today, and hopefully I answered them all for you. And here is my contact information, and I just want